Thank you for joining us at the Roundtable.
Brought to you by Community Education Arts, a nonprofit organization based in Noblesville, Indiana.
I'm Alice Cavanis-Gober, president of CEArts.
And I'm Sarah E. Morin, secretary of CEArts. Let's sit down at the Roundtable. I'd like to remind you a little bit about our NICE project. Our NICE project is always based upon classic literature. There's always going to be unavoidable issues that come with the study of literature, with intolerance, prejudice, discrimination, racism, gender bias, domestic abuse, as well as problematic social inequalities due to the class systems and patriarchal dominance. Our project's goals are to breathe new life into the classics by encouraging critical thinking, in-depth discussions of themes and issues in the works selected, and to invite you to experiment with your creativity. With these goals in mind, we'll do our best to discuss any unpleasant and discomforting aspects of our book choices, with understanding the cultural context of the times in which they were written, and the periods in which the stories are set, and a consciousness of how these books relate to today. The books we're studying this year are Gone with the Wind by Margaret Mitchell, Dracula by Bram Stoker, Little Women by Louisa May Alcott, and Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte.
To further our little recap a little bit, we've already discussed racism, prejudice, intolerance, and discrimination in all 4 of our selected books, and we've looked at structure and its impact in each book.
Great. You want to talk some more about other forms of class that get raised?
Well, I think we quickly touch on orphans in Jane Eyre. We've got the Lowood charity children, the treatment of Adele, the ward, the / illegitimate child. We're not really sure. We discussed that in previous episodes a little bit. We discussed children quite a bit because some of the children in Gone with the Wind, for example, have some issues that we had to talk about, and also in Little Women, there are babies born. I think that one of the things that we really noticed about class in Little Women, in particular, is this notion of caring for the poverty-stricken German immigrants. Remembering that the girls, the 4 March sisters, are not wealthy, right? But they have been brought up with a sense of duty, Christian duty, to care for those who have less than they do. And in Little Women, that is depicted by the poverty-stricken German immigrants. And, the girls are supposed to be caring about them despite the risk to themselves for contracting diseases like scarlet fever, which it happens to Beth, right? That, to me, when we reread this book in the midst of a global pandemic about COVID-19, I was like, oh, the healthcare workers, that's what I thought immediately of healthcare workers and how they are, doing their duty as their job, and they're obviously doing that because they're called to that duty, almost the same way that people have religious callings. Healthcare workers are usually, called to that in some way, and they are caring for people despite the risk to themselves for contracting COVID-19. And so that became quite, kind of a relevant, poignant subtext for me as we looked at class in Little Women. Not so much that it's class in the healthcare COVID-19 situation, but it did seem to be sort of a relevant comparison, I guess.
I think so. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. And then, of course, we have to think about, masters and slaves as the ultimate horrific example of class structure. And in Dracula, for once, we actually can say something, because in Dracula, you have this sexual, physical, psychological enslavement almost going on, between Dracula himself and all of his victims, from Renfield to Jonathan to Lucy to Mina. Even in some ways, Van Helsing is like obsessed with Dracula, and obsession makes you a slave, whether you want to admit it or not. It does. So, and not that Van Helsing ever admits that, but but I feel like Dracula, we did have a master. I mean, Renfield calls Dracula his master. I mean, eek. But then, of course, we turn again to Gone with the Wind, the ultimate master and slave example of our 4 books. And we have Scarlet and the treatment of Tara's slaves. We have Rhett and Mammy. Their relationship was so complicated and so, in some ways, beautiful, and in some ways emblematic of kind of that mythology stuff too. So we got like divided feelings about all of that. Melanie's racism, which again is not really in the movie as much as it is just blatant in the book. All of that problematic racial content is especially poignant and relevant to this year's readers. And we felt this, as you mentioned, because of the murder of George Floyd, the Breonna Taylor court case and everything, and, the Black Lives Matter movement. We cannot ignore, or at least I couldn't, I shouldn't speak for you, but I could not ignore, as I reread Gone with the Wind this year, I couldn't ignore, thinking about and comparing different characters and situations in the book with what I was seeing across my news screen and stuff when, Trump supporters were out there arming themselves, taking to the streets, intimidating people, peaceful groups, especially the Black Lives Matter groups, and even voting centers, and, plotting to kidnap the governor of Michigan. And so, like the Old South and Gone with the Wind, those modern day people, and unfortunately, many GOP elected officials across the country are actively engaging in actions and rhetoric that threaten to destroy the United States of America by actively calling for revolution and secession. I mean, this is happening on our news screens today, and it's just like unbelievable. It's like, the words civil war have been said out loud in the news. It's just like, what? So that kind of mind-blowing, when we selected Gone with the Wind early on, before it was officially the 2020, project, when we first started selecting books, and it was in the top 8, and then we narrowed it down to being in one of the top 4. Never could we have predicted that the stuff we're seeing in the news with Trump supporters and those armed white men and women with their assault rifles and stuff. I mean, and Trump flags flying and Confederate flags flying. I mean, I don't think we could have predicted that. And so reading this book this year, while that was going on outside our windows on our TV screens, I don't know. I feel like, our original question of how do you find relevance in, old classics that have problematic content? Well, hello. I mean, Gone with the Wind couldn't have become more relevant if we tried to make it more relevant. I mean, did you get a sense of any of that while we were? Oh,
for sure.
I mean, especially as we were discussing and recording, and literally on the same days that we were discussing and recording things, about Gone with the Wind, things were happening in our real lives that, we may not have mentioned because we don't want to be political when we're discussing our books. But here in our recap, I think we have to say that was a huge part of how we saw this book this year, don't you?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I remember that, especially right after the murder of George Floyd, you and I were like,
how do we talk about this?
Do we need to back off of Gone with the Wind? And both you and I came to the conclusion that no, we need to dig in because this is important. This is an issue.
It is. And it just was so hard to find the appropriate words. And I hope we did an okay job with that. I think another part of that is going to come to the forefront in our recap today when we're talking about the depictions of religion and spirituality, because so many of the Trump supporters are these, extreme right-wing Christian. They label themselves as Christian. And so coming to terms with what Christianity and Jesus Christ and the teachings of Christ, or whatever, however you want to talk about that, how that has played out, not just today and in Gone with the Wind or whatever, but across history, in history as a whole, has really been something we've struggled with, I think, this year with a couple of our books. And I think that, we didn't really get a good focused episode on that. We kind of ran out of time, with some of our topics. Join us next time as we continue our recap discussion for the 6th annual NICE project. This has been At the Roundtable with Alice
and Sarah E.
of Community Education Arts.
Our nonprofit organization is based in Noblesville, Indiana. You can find us online at CEArts.org. We'd like to thank James Weston for writing our intro music and for his technical savvy.
Join us next time
at the Roundtable.